My own mother and sister had my 5-year-old son sitting in front of 2 police officers, shaking and crying, because they thought it would teach him respect. Please stay with me as I tell you what happened, and why they'll regret it for the rest of their lives. And if this makes you as furious as it made me, don't be surprised. I'm a single mom, and every bit of my life is built around my little boy, Ethan. He's the kind of kid who waves at strangers in the grocery store, tells me every silly dream he remembers, and thinks dinosaurs might still be hiding somewhere. I work long hours, but I do it for him, to keep a roof over our heads, to make sure he has the childhood I never got. When I have to travel for work, my family steps in to watch him. At least, that's the arrangement we've had. It's always been a mix of my mother, my sister, and sometimes my uncle. On paper, it sounds like a blessing. Free childcare from people who are supposed to love him as much as I do. But anyone who's grown up with my family knows they have a very specific definition of love, and it comes with rules that never made sense to me as a kid and still don't now. In their minds, a child who hesitates to follow an order is disrespectful. A kid who cries is manipulative. My mom calls it raising them right. I call it control disguised as discipline. At first, I told myself I was overthinking it. Ethan would come home quieter after a weekend with. I'd convinced myself he was just tired. But then he started flinching when I raised my voice even slightly. Once, he asked me if I'd ever call the police if he was. It stopped me cold. I laughed it off, told him of course not, but deep down something twisted in my stomach. Where'd he even get that idea? Still, I pushed it aside. I had a big project at work, a short business trip coming up, and I needed help. My mom agreed to take him for 3 days. She sounded almost cheerful about it, which I took as a good sign. I told Ethan it would be like a little vacation with Grandma. He nodded, but he didn't smile. Something in me should have listened to that look on his face. Something should have made me slow down, ask more questions, change the plan. But I didn't. I packed my bag, kissed him goodbye, and told myself it was fine. I had no idea that while I was gone, my family would decide Ethan needed to be put in his place. I had no idea they would call the police on a 5-year-old. I didn't know that when I came home early, thinking I'd surprise him, I'd walk into a nightmare that would change everything. The morning I left for the trip felt routine enough. My bag was already in the car, my mind on the meetings ahead. Ethan was with my mother, sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of toast in hand. I hugged him tight, kissed the top of his head, and forced myself not to linger. I trusted I'd be gone a few days, and that when I came back, he'd be waiting with one of those running start hugs that knocked the breath out of me. Work went faster than I expected. A last-minute schedule change wrapped everything up a full day early. On the drive back, I decided not to call ahead. I wanted the joy of showing up on it. In my head, I pictured Ethan's face lighting up when he saw me, his little arms wrapping around me like I'd been gone for weeks instead of days. But when I pulled into our driveway, the first crack in that happy picture appeared. The spot where my mother's sedan usually sat was empty. No car meant they weren't here. That alone wasn't impossible. Maybe they'd gone to the park or the store, but the quiet felt wrong. I tried my mother's phone, straight to voicemail. My sister's rang 4 times before cutting off. I called again. Nothing. By the 3rd try, a faint hum of worry had settled low in my chest. I stood in the driveway a moment, keys still in hand, telling myself it was nothing. But the silence seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. The drive to my mother's house was automatic, every turn so familiar I could do it blindfold. Still, my grip on the wheel tightened the closer I got. Something was off, not the usual subtle kind of off I'd brushed away before, but a sharp, prickling wrongness I couldn't explain. I turned onto her street, half expecting to see her car in the driveway and feel silly for overreacting. Instead, my stomach dropped. 2 police cruisers sat out front, their light bars dark but unmistakable. My mother's car was there, parked neatly behind them, as if nothing was unusual. I pulled over so fast the seatbelt dug into my shoulder. My first thought was of Ethan. Where was he, and why were police here? The scene was too quiet for sirens or chaos, but that didn't matter. The sight alone was enough to set every nerve on edge. I stepped out, my legs carrying me faster than I realized, heart pounding hard enough I could hear it in my ear. I didn't wait to knock. I didn't think about how I'd explain barging in. Whatever was happening inside, I needed to see my son, and I needed to see him now. The door gave way under my hand before I even registered turning the knob. My sister was there instantly, stepping into the narrow hallway like she could physically stop me from getting. Her arms spread wide, palms out, her voice low and sharp. "You can't come in right now." I didn't slow down. Her shoulder clipped mine as I shoved past, her protest cutting through the air, but something else caught my attention and made every muscle lock. A thin, breaking wail coming from deeper inside the house. Ethan's voice. The sound pulled me forward, past the family photos lining the wall, into the living room where the noise grew raw and uneven. My son sat on the couch, his small body pressed tight against my mother's side, his face wet and blotchy. He gasped between sobs, curling his fists into his shirt like he could disappear inside it. My mother's hand rested on his shoulder, not in comfort, but in that stiff, unmoving way she uses when she wants someone to. Two uniformed officers stood over him, clipboards in hand. One was scribbling notes, the other watching Ethan with an unreadable expression. They weren't threatening him physically, but their presence alone was enough to make the whole room feel colder. The clink of a pen against a metal clip cut through the sound of my son's crying. When he saw me, his head jerked up so fast his hair stuck to his wet cheeks. "Mommy," he choked out, voice breaking, "please don't let them take me." His legs slid off the couch as if he meant to run to me, but my mother's grip tightened, holding him there. Everything narrowed, the walls, the air, my patience. I stepped between him and the officers, my voice sharper than I intended. "What is going on? Why are the police here?" Neither officer answered right away. My mother's mouth opened like she had something rehearsed, but I kept my eyes locked on the uniforms in front of me. Whatever this was, whatever reason they thought justified standing over a crying child, I wasn't leaving without an answer, and I wasn't leaving without him. My mother's voice cut through the tension first, smooth and certain, like she'd been waiting for a moment. She leaned back slightly, still keeping one hand anchored on Ethan, and said, "He was completely out of control, talking back, ignoring instructions, acting like he runs the place." Her tone wasn't raised, but it carried that smug finality she uses when she thinks the matter is closed. From behind me, my sister piped up, chin tilted just enough to signal she thought she was the reasonable one. "You weren't here to handle it, so we brought in real authority. Kids need to understand there are consequences for disrespect." The word consequences rolled off her tongue like she was proud of it. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, my grandmother's slow, deliberate nod. She didn't speak, but the approval in her expression said enough. To her, this wasn't just acceptable, it was proper. Somewhere in the doorway, my uncle had appeared, arms folded across his chest. He looked at me like I was the naive one in the room. "Some kids only learn the hard way," he muttered, as if he were imparting wisdom instead of justifying what I was seeing. Ethan's breathing was still uneven, but now his eyes were locked on me, wide and wide. Every word they spoke made my pulse slow in that dangerous way, each beat harder, heavier. The shock I'd felt walking into this scene was already shifting, cooling, sharpening, aligning into something I could use. One of the officers glanced at his partner before clearing his throat. "There's no immediate danger here," he said carefully, as if trying not to step into family politics. "But we are required to document the incident." The faint scratch of a pen against paper followed. I didn't say anything yet. I just stood there, hand on my son's shoulder now, the fury settling into place like a loaded spring, knowing I'd remember every detail of this. I crouched down so I could meet Ethan's eyes, my hand steady on his back. His breathing hitched as I told him he was safe now, that I was right here. It took a few moments before he could get the words out, each one breaking off like it cost him something to say. He told me he'd been in the living room earlier, building something with his blocks. He was almost done, he said. It was supposed to be a castle with a tower taller than the couch. That's when my mother told him it was time to put everything away. He said he asked if he could finish first, that he said it nicely. But instead of letting him keep going, she scooped the blocks into a bin and set them out of reach. His face crumpled at the memory, his small hands gripping his knees. He admitted he cried, not loud enough to be yelling, just enough to make his eyes sting. That's when, according to him, voices got sharp. He heard the word defiant. He didn't know what it meant, only that it made his stomach hurt. My sister came into the room, talking about how kids these days think they can ignore adults. Then there was the sound of a phone being dialed. He thought maybe they were calling me, but it wasn't me. It was 911. They told the person on the other end there was an emergency. Ethan's voice went quieter as he told me that part, like he wasn't sure if saying it out loud would get him in trouble. By the time he finished, I already knew the conclusion I was coming to. The officers could close their notebooks, my relatives could think whatever they wanted. This would be the last time they ever had him to themselves. Whatever they called discipline, I called something else entirely, and I wasn't going to give them another chance. I stood, keeping my hand on Ethan's shoulder, and told him we were leaving. My mother started to speak, but I didn't look at her. My sister's voice followed, sharp and accusing, demanding I hear them out. I didn't pause to answer either of them. We walked straight to the door, my son pressed close to my side, his small fingers wrapped tight around mine. The air outside felt different, cooler, cleaner, as we crossed the driveway. I got him buckled into the car, making sure his seatbelt was snug before shutting the door. When I slid behind the wheel, I didn't look back. The sound of footsteps on the pavement and my name being called faded as soon as the engine turned over. Once we were home, I set him up with his favorite blanket and a quiet show, something familiar to drown out the day. Then I picked up the phone. The first call went to a lawyer I knew through a friend, one who didn't waste time with small talk. I explained the situation in as few words as possible. By the time we hung up, she was already drafting a cease and desist that would make sure none of them could have Ethan alone again. Next, I contacted the police department to request the official report. When it arrived later that day, I read every line slowly, my jaw tightening. They hadn't just exaggerated, they'd fabricated. Words like violent and destructive were used to describe a 5-year-old who had been building with blocks. The statements painted a picture so far from reality, it was almost unrecognizable. One detail stood out more than the rest: the call to 911. Not the non-emergency line, not a local contact, but the number reserved for real crises. I could picture the dispatcher taking that call, while someone else with an actual emergency waited in line. It wasn't just cruel, it was reckless. I set the papers down, the decision I'd made earlier now reinforced in black and white. They crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and I was making sure it stayed that way. I waited until Ethan was asleep before making the next round of calls. The first number I dialed was his kindergarten classroom. His teacher picked up on the second ring, her voice warm but curious about why I was calling after hours. I told her briefly what had happened, careful to keep my tone even. She didn't even hesitate. "That doesn't sound like him at all," she said firmly. She described how he helps other kids clean up, how he's gentle with the younger ones, how she's never seen a hint of aggression from him. By the end of the call, she offered to put it all in writing, something official I could use if... The next call went to his pediatrician. When I explained, she let out a slow sigh, the kind that carries more disappointment to prize. She told me his reactions were completely normal for his age, that asking to finish playing before cleaning up was not defiance, but typical child behavior. Then her voice shifted, more serious. She warned me that introducing police in such a young child's world could leave lasting effects: fear, mistrust, anxiety. The kind of marks you can't always see right away. I could hear her typing in the background as she spoke. Before we hung up, she promised to provide a detailed statement about his development and temperament, along with her professional opinion on why the incident was harmful. She said she'd send it to both me and my lawyer by the next. When I set the phone down, there was a small stack of proof building. Not just my word against theirs, but the voices of people who saw Ethan for who he really was. It wasn't just about defending him anymore. It was about making sure no one could twist his nature into something ugly. Later that night, I called my cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to in months, but who'd grown up under the same roof I had. When I told her what had happened, she went quiet for a beat, then let out a bitter laugh. "That's nothing new," she said, and began telling me about the time she was locked in a dark basement for refusing to eat a certain dish. She couldn't have been more than 7. No one had ever apologized. Her story opened a door I couldn't close. I started reaching out to others, old friends of the family, more distant relatives, anyone who might have seen behind the curtain. Piece by piece, the same picture emerged. My family had been running the same playbook for decades. Strict rules disguised as care, punishment dressed up as teaching, obedience valued over understanding. The targets were always children, the ones least able to defend themselves. An old neighbor remembered my sister being made to stand outside in the snow without a coat because she didn't say thank you fast enough. A former babysitter told me she quit after being told to handle my younger cousin with a belt if he didn't follow direction. Each account was different in detail, but identical in tone. The adults convinced they were doing the right thing, even when the harm was obvious. By the time I set my phone down, the pattern was undeniable. This wasn't a one-off lapse in judgment. It wasn't even just about Ethan. It was the same controlling mindset passed down, dressed up as tradition, and enforced without question. The more I heard, the more I understood that stopping them now wasn't just for my son's sake. It was to break something that had been allowed to keep going for far too long. I didn't call ahead. The papers were in a folder under my arm, the weight of them matching the steady rhythm in my chest as I walked up to my mother's porch. When the door opened, she looked ready to dismiss me with a single glance, but I stepped inside before she could speak. My sister was on the couch, my uncle leaning against the doorway, both watching like they expected an apology. I set the folder on the coffee table, flipped it open, pulling out the first page. "This," I said, tapping the header, "is the official report." Their eyes followed my finger as I began to read the lines word for word. The claims of violent outbursts, destruction, and threats. The same lies I'd seen in black and white now filled the room aloud, each sentence heavier than the last. When I looked up, no one spoke. My grandmother's face had tightened. My mother's mouth was a hard line, but there was no denial. I pulled out the next stack, the statements from Ethan's teacher and doctor, and laid them down one by one. Calm, factual, impossible to twist. Then I told them I hadn't kept this quiet. Every relative who still speaks to me had heard the truth. So had the neighbors they like to impress, and the church friends they lean on for their reputation. The story wasn't just mine anymore. It was theirs too, and it was out. I gathered the papers, slid them back into the folder, and stood. "You won't see him without me. Not ever." The words weren't shouted, but they landed with finality. No discussion, no compromise. As I walked out, I didn't look back. Whatever connection we'd had was over, and I was the one who'd cut it clean. The order from my lawyer went into effect within days, leaving no room for interpretation. Any contact without me present would be a violation, and they knew it. That didn't stop them from trying to salvage their image. I heard from mutual acquaintances that they were telling a very different version, one where I'd overreacted, where they'd simply been concerned about my parenting. But the story they told didn't stick. The teacher, the doctor, the neighbors who'd seen the police cars, they all knew better. Words spread faster than they could control, and the sympathy they expected never came. One by one, people they counted on stopped returning calls, stopped inviting them to gatherings, stopped treating them like the moral authority they'd always pretended to be. At home, my focus was on Ethan. We talked about what had happened in ways he could understand, making sure he knew it wasn't his fault. Nights were spent reading together, days filled with small, steady routines to rebuild the sense of security they'd tried to shake. I watched his laugh return slowly. His eyes stopped darting to the door at sudden noise. They'd set out to frighten him into obedience. Instead, they'd only managed to erase themselves from our lives entirely. They wanted to teach my son consequences. Now they're living with their